Good afternoon on today's Angry Bulletin.
3, 2, 1.
It was a test flight unlike any other in human history. Starship, the largest rocket ever constructed, achieved the suborbital trajectory that was planned. The separation went very well, hot staging went very well, and the rocket made it halfway around the planet as planned and then began its re-entry. However, there were already problems even before the re-entry took place, and those problems became even more significant when SpaceX lost contact with the rocket. So, was the test successful enough? All of this and more coming at you on the Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to another bulletin of the Angry Astronaut, another bulletin in the aftermath of a Starship test. I'll tell you, such a spectacular experience and so many amazing things accomplished, and this is coming from a guy who wasn't even there to see it happen. And I was incredibly envious of the other people who got to be there, but that's life, and the viewers had supported my previous trip to Washington, D.C. Certainly couldn't expect at the 11th hour for people to just start throwing more money at me. I totally understand. For those of you who did contribute, thank you so much. That will definitely be applied to a future trip. But if I may say something really quick, and you can skip to here if you're not interested in all of that, the amount of money that I make off of monetization on this channel just continues to plunge. Google continues to get worse and worse at selling their advertising services to prospective buyers. And as they get worse at it, well, we creators make less money, and actually Google is making less money also. This doesn't spell a very good future for YouTube, but that's the reality. In the meantime, if I was, as I've said a number of times, at 1% of my subscribers being Patreon supporters at the $5 level, well, then none of this would ever be a consideration. I would be able to go to any and all of these kinds of launch opportunities and bring you the experience right then and there. But I understand. Times are tough. I certainly don't want your support if things are financially difficult for you. I absolutely do not want that. However, if you are able to spare $5 a month, there's a lot of benefits. You're a member of my Discord server, you get exclusive content, early release content, and a chance to talk to me directly on Sundays if you want to. That, in my opinion, the ability to talk to me, I think, is a dubious benefit at best, but some people enjoy it. So you get all of that, $5 a month, pretty reasonable, I think. And just so you know, I support a number of creators on Patreon as well, most of them digital artists, but people who do really good work. And I tell you, I feel very comfortable about doing that sort of thing for these creators, and that's essentially what I'm asking for here, and that is all I'm going to say about it. Let's get on to Starship. So as I go through this analysis, you're going to discover that I'm pretty harsh on SpaceX, pretty exacting. And I'll tell you something, I wouldn't be this way at all if SpaceX had not secured a contract to put human beings on the moon, at first by 2024, which as we can see was always clearly impossible, but by 2026, September of 2026, that was always going to be an extremely uphill battle. And after yesterday, well, it's an impossible battle at this point. Not necessarily because there's no way SpaceX could possibly get Starship ready to put human beings on the moon in the next 2.5 years, but with every test like this, every test that does not adhere to the exact flight plan that was presented to the FAA, we have a mishap. And with a mishap, there come a whole lot of other requirements that are going to create a considerable delay before we see IFT-4. I'm going to start off this video with a quote from journalist Eric Berger, who I really respect, but I have to admit, I think the guy is fully biased when it comes to SpaceX, and I'll try to explain why as soon as I'm done with this quote. Starship burnt up, Super Heavy crashed. It's easy to see failure. If you want, go ahead, but this is failing forward at its finest. One of SpaceX's secret sauces is an acceptance of failure as a means to an end. We are much nearer that end. Rapid and fully reusable launch today. NASA could never take this approach. Not really can traditional contractors reliant on cost-plus contracts. Congress and shareholders don't want to see failure. They want to see success from the start. But it comes at a high cost of time, money, and stifling innovation. In general, I actually agree with what he's saying here, but at the same time, would we be saying the same thing if this had happened to SLS in 2022? Would we be saying this if even the Orion had burnt up in 2022 and everything else had gone absolutely perfectly with the flight? Absolutely not. Because SLS is much further along in its development, it is a fully mature system, and Starship is not. So obviously we can't hold Starship to the same standards that we hold SLS or much of any other rocket. But herein lies the problem. We are expecting Starship to carry out a feat by September of 2026 that only a mature rocket system should be trying to do, and that is landing human beings on the moon by September of 2026, 2.5 years from now, which is not going to happen. And that is a very important consideration that we really need to keep in mind when we use terms like failing forward. If this was SpaceX on its own, developing Starship at their own pace, and when they get it ready to go to Mars, that's great. And if it's not ready to go to Mars yet, no problem, because Falcon 9 can handle virtually all the business they have anyway. Well, that's no big deal. But when they have a contracted obligation to put human beings on the surface of the moon by September of 2026, they need to be held to different standards, because we are spending, and by we I'm talking the American taxpayers, over $1.3 billion on HLS this year alone. That's an awful lot of money for a solution that isn't going to be able to carry out its contracted obligations. But let's start off with the things that went well. As you can see, the hot staging seemed to go very well indeed. Also, all 33 Raptor engines on Super Heavy started up successfully and completed a full duration burn during ascent. Following separation, Super Heavy completed a flip maneuver. That's fantastic as well, and also completed a full boost back burn to send it towards its splashdown point. At that point, however, things started to go wrong for Super Heavy. It did light several engines for its first ever landing burn, but apparently not enough engines, and the vehicle experienced an RUD at that point. We're not exactly sure what caused the RUD, only that happened at an altitude of approximately 462 meters, about 7 minutes into the mission. So the booster got a lot closer to a soft splashdown, but apparently it exploded about half a kilometer up. After that, Starship's second stage Raptor engines all started successfully and powered the vehicle to its expected orbit, becoming the first Starship to complete its full duration ascent burn. Great news! And while coasting, Starship accomplished several of the flight test's additional objectives, and this included, as we saw, the opening and closing of a payload door, or the Pez dispenser as we call it, that's going to be able to chuck out lots and lots of Starlink satellites in the future, and also initiating a propellant transfer demonstration. Now, we don't know exactly how well that propellant transfer to demonstration went because it says they initiated it. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of the propellant was transferred from one tank to another. We'll have to wait to see what SpaceX has to say about that. That's an extremely important part of Starship's operations, the ability to transfer fuel in low Earth orbit. But frankly, we are a long ways away from that. Starship also did not attempt its planned on-orbit relight of a single Raptor engine due to the vehicle roll rates during its coast. It's very interesting. Suggests that they may have been losing some control of the rocket during the orbit, which, again, a little odd, but we're going to see what happened with that as time goes on. Oh, by the way, I mentioned Starlink before. Wow, Starlink carried out its job spectacularly during this flight, as did the cameras that they had on board. Amazing, spectacular views of our Earth, of Starship's flight, of the re-entry. Everything was unbelievable. And the fact that Starlink continued to operate, as well as the cameras, while the ship was being consumed by this inferno that you're watching right now, well, that is nothing short of miraculous. Quite an accomplishment, and once again, props to SpaceX for all of these amazing milestones that they were able to achieve during this test flight. However, once the re-entry began, that's when things started to go a little wrong, and control of the rocket became a bit questionable. Well, not just a bit questionable. It was clear that they had lost a great deal of control. Starship can only successfully re-enter by performing a belly flip maneuver. And just prior to this belly flip maneuver, it was clear that Starship was losing a lot of heat tiles for some reason as it started to hit the atmosphere. And then, once it was fully engaged with the re-entry, at first it appeared that it was presenting its belly to the atmosphere and that the plasma was hitting the heat shield as it was supposed to, but that situation got progressively worse until the ship was clearly enveloped in plasma and the signal was finally lost. And Starship, apparently, according to SpaceX, completely burned up in the atmosphere, so no splashdown was achieved at that point. So there was a mishap both during the launch and during the re-entry. There's no easy way to say that. And again, that would not be a big deal if SpaceX was not working against a time crunch. Now, before I get into that though, I'd like to read some of the observations of one of my team members who has a lot of experience in the spaceflight industry. Actually does a lot of work with the military on rockets. So this is what he had to say about the re-entry footage that he saw. Quote, "I see Starship shedding a lot of material and not really maintaining a constant attitude. Almost looks to be tumbling at the start until around the 4-minute mark of the footage. After it gets about 100 kilometers in altitude, it seems to snap to a nose-in attitude until the end. The flaps don't seem to be able to control it until around 3 minutes and 30 seconds in the footage, but it never got to a fully belly-down attitude. After that, you can watch the plasma blanket wander around, suggesting a changing attitude. Not sure if that's intentional or not, but it doesn't strike me as being the designed operation." I agree with that, actually. It appears that the control of Starship may have been a bit questionable during this re-entry process right from the beginning, and that presents a number of questions. Are the flaps and fins sufficient to control this rocket during a re-entry? That's very different than the descents that we've observed up to this point that have been carried out from an altitude of 10 kilometers. A re-entry through the atmosphere is very different than a descent from 10 kilometers. That could suggest some aerodynamic issues that need to be corrected with this rocket, and that could take some time. And also, we have no choice, as I said before, but to call this a mishap. Now, there are clearly no populations at risk. That's not the point. The point is, if Starship deviates at all from the FAA-approved flight plan, then that's a mishap that requires an investigation, and the FAA FAA confirmed that shortly after I asked them from a comment yesterday. Quote, a mishap occurred during the SpaceX Starship OFT-3, IFT-3, whatever you want to call it, mission that launched from Boca Chica, Texas on March 14th. The mishap involved both the Super Heavy booster and the Starship vehicle. No public injuries or public property damage have been reported. The FAA is overseeing the SpaceX-led mishap investigation to ensure the company complies with its FAA-approved mishap investigation plan and other regulatory requirements. So a mishap, just to be 100% clear here, is any test flight where any one of the 9 following events takes place, where a flight involves number 1, a serious injury or fatality. Obviously that didn't happen. Malfunction of a safety critical system. That probably didn't happen here, but again, we can't say for certain. Failure of a safety organization, safety operations, or safety procedures. Probably not. High risk of causing serious or fatal injuries to any spaceflight participant, crew, government, astronaut, or member of the public. No. Substantial damage to property not associated with the activity. No. Unplanned substantial damage to property associated with the activity. Well, yes, they didn't plan to have Starship completely burn up in the atmosphere. They wanted to at least have something to recover, and that certainly applies to the booster as well. But there's a lot more. Unplanned permanent loss of the vehicle. Yep, that definitely happened. Impact of hazardous debris outside of defined areas. No, that did not happen. Failure to complete a launch or re-entry as planned. The re-entry did not happen as planned. The launch didn't happen as planned either, because Super Heavy experienced an RUD about half a kilometer up. It did not carry out a safe landing in the Gulf of Mexico. Granted, these are relatively small issues compared to the problems that we've had in the past, but nevertheless, this requires an investigation. SpaceX has to determine why these things happened, what they're going to do to correct them, and there's going to be a list of corrective actions that need to be undertaken. This will most probably delay the next test flight by at least a couple of months. And until we get to a point to where Starship is performing these test flights flawlessly, it is really going to slow down the launch cadence, and therefore the development of this vehicle. Now, as far as the FAA is concerned, they don't care whether or not Starship is developed swiftly. Certainly they would like to see that happen, but their primary focus is on public safety. That's all they care about. And if you're interested in the FAA's perspective on these things, I have an exclusive interview with the assistant administrator of the FAA linked at the end of this video if you'd like to watch that. Now, of course, the public was never really in danger here, but any flight that doesn't go as planned and any rocket that doesn't perform as planned technically presents a danger to the public, because you don't know what a rocket is going to do if it doesn't perform as planned. Therefore, you need to find out why it fell outside of SpaceX's control, why it didn't do what SpaceX anticipated, make sure it doesn't happen again. I actually don't find that to be tremendously unreasonable, but it does delay the development of the rocket. And with every delay, the possibility of a September 2026 landing on the moon becomes more and more remote. As a matter of fact, it becomes virtually impossible at this point. So what do we do about it? In my opinion, NASA needs to change their plans for Artemis 3 right now. Artemis 3 needs to be all about the deployment of the Lunar Gateway, and perhaps putting some astronauts on board the Lunar Gateway for a few weeks to test the idea of keeping astronauts in lunar orbit for the long term. I think that that would be a very useful mission, one that would accomplish a great deal for our long-term plans, and one that would not require Starship. The first components of the Lunar Gateway are scheduled to be delivered by Falcon Heavy, and the astronauts can be delivered by SLS. You don't need Starship to take a very big step forward with our plans for Artemis. And honestly, I think that would be the best way to proceed, rather than putting unnecessary demands and unnecessary and unrealistic expectations on SpaceX, because NASA and and our plans for the moon don't need to be running on Elon time. It's just not going to work. So once again, a huge leap forward, just not a big enough leap if we want to get to the moon by 2026. Once again, there are solutions to this problem. We just need to make the necessary changes now. Thank you very much for watching. I'd like to thank Jim Sanger, Andrew Beaumont, Will Taylor, Stephen Vargo, and Juan Barzaghi, the latest Patreon supporters for this channel. Really appreciate your help. If you'd like to become a Patreon supporter as well, all the details are in the description, or you can also support this channel through PayPal or by purchasing some of this new awesome merch created by digital artist Nick Henning. I'll tell you, if you like SLS or you like Starship, you are going to love these new designs. Thanks once again, and as always, stay angry about space.